This. Hello, everyone. Today, I'm here to talk to you about simplifying complexity. And so in my last UX showcase in August, I was encouraged by Vitika to speak about this topic. So how can we simplify the complexity in GitLab? It's I think, a question that is on everyone's mind almost every day. This is also something I discussed recently at an event organized by OutSystems, a low-code platform, as they're facing similar challenges of complexity that we do. And throughout this presentation, I added links to learning resources in case you want to dig more into a particular concept, because there are many things. I mean, we could dedicate a presentation to each one of those concepts. So yeah, let's do this. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Pedro. I'm a staff product designer, and I'm a maintainer of our design system, Pajamas. I've been at GitLab for almost 7 years. It will be 7 years this month. And I've worked a little bit in every part of GitLab. I'm born, raised, and based in Lisbon, although today it's not sunny, it's cloudy. And so back in 2018, for context, I was fortunate enough to participate in an amazing workshop with Jared Spool and Dana Chisnell, renowned UX experts, about designing for delight. And there were so many great things there, but among other things, we worked on answering this question: how can we inspire our organization to go beyond shiny features with products and services that deliver remarkable delight? And this is a great question to answer. This presentation is inspired by a lot of what I learned that day. So before we get into the how we can deal with complexity, let's understand how and why complexity affects GitLab. A great concept to frame this complexity challenge is experience rot, introduced by Jared Spool. It's fairly straightforward. Experience rot builds up as products slowly add more and more features in an effort to surpass users' expectations and beat the competition. The problem is that many of those features are actually not essential to users or were not considered in the original design. We've all been there, right? So more features means more complexity and worse experience. One side effect of experience rot is that the complexity increases the cost to support and scale the product. And as Jared explains, it not only makes design and development difficult, it puts the entire organization at risk. To understand the experience rot in practice, let's look at the Kano model. So this model was developed in Japan in the 1980s by Professor Noriaki Kano, after analyzing how different companies spent their money and the resulting customer satisfaction. And so here on the horizontal axis, we can see how much product investment is made. You can think of this as the level of feature, functionality, sophistication, or how well it is implemented. And on the vertical axis, it's how much customers are frustrated or satisfied. And he identified several categories to map the product investments to this model. The first one is performance payoffs. So better, but complex, right? This is the kind of investments that the more you invest, the more satisfied customers become. It's the typical make it better by adding more and more features, right? The main issue is that you have to keep investing to get more satisfaction. And while this is happening, the product is becoming more and more complex. The second is basic expectations. And these are the must-haves, the things that customers naturally expect that don't even need to be mentioned. An example in GitLab is editing a file through the web UI without having to clone the repository to your local machine. These basic expectations don't get praised by our customers, but they get really frustrated if they're not there. And the third, most exciting, also to its name, is the excitement generators. These aspects of the product just go beyond the basic expectations. They exceed them and delight customers. And yes, that can certainly be done through a huge investment on a magical feature. But most of the time, just a small investment can add delight in an unexpected way. For example, making the experience more pleasurable, like those celebratory messages that appear when you're merging an MR, right, to celebrate your success. Another way is through animation. And I invite you to check Julia's recent UX showcase, which has a lot of great ideas of how we can make the experience more delightful through animation. Yet another approach to delight is by removing friction from the user's flow, by making a task faster, shorter, or simpler to complete. A flow example in GitLab is making it quicker for users to start working on their project by pushing a README file to the repository when the project is created. And the ultimate approach to delight is infusing meaning into the experience. For example, in GitLab, our user profile badges highlight user contributions and accomplishments, helping create a sense of community and purpose. And because we don't have all the time in the world for this presentation, I'll just be focusing on the performance payoffs and the basic expectations. And performance payoffs in GitLab is usually where we tend to invest in. And I'll show you in a bit why this happens. Our most recent qualitative analysis of the SUS verbatim, driven by Erica, suggests that we're not making progress in terms of meeting user expectations. We also received an increased amount of feedback that our product is not intuitive and is complex, confusing. So generally speaking, this is usually a result of misunderstanding what users value, knowing their basic expectations and what makes them excited. And if we are over-investing in performance payoffs, we are creating experience rot. At GitLab, avoiding experience rot is a constant challenge for us. Why? First, let's look at the 4 phases of DevOps. So in the first 3 phases, bring your own, best in class, and do it yourself. There are different tools for each part of the DevOps lifecycle, and it's a challenge to integrate them. And to solve that, we have the 4th phase, the miraculous single application like GitLab, where all capabilities are integrated seamlessly. So basically what this means is that GitLab is competing with specific tools. And although these tools usually require custom integration and are smaller in scope, they are more focused and aren't as prone to experience rot as GitLab. And how are we competing with those specific tools? Our product has 8 stages and more than 50 categories. So this means that we replace dozens of specialized tools and consolidate hundreds of features under a single experience. And this is fertile ground for experience rot. At the same time, GitLab has 2 flywheel strategies that reinforce each other: the open core flywheel and the development spend flywheel. So being an open core product is both an advantage and a challenge. An advantage for us is that it enables innovation from GitLab and also innovation from the wider community. That's great. Every quarter, as we know, hundreds of improvements are contributed by our customers and users. More contributions can lead to more features, which can lead to more users in this virtuous cycle. The challenge is how well we can manage this cycle and avoid experience rot. More innovation is great as it allows us at the same time to cover more ground of the software development lifecycle. We go beyond developers and start including business, security, and operations people. We all know this, right? The challenge is how to cater to many personas in the same UI. This table shows how personas typically use the stages of GitLab. And some stages serve 8, 11, or even 15 personas at the same time, right? And finally, adding to this challenge, we have our seed then nurture strategy principle. And just very quickly quoting our handbook, if you're not familiar with this strategy principle, it says, when we are early in a particular area of the product, we will plant seeds by shipping a small MVC. And shipping functionality that is incomplete to expand the scope sometimes goes against our instincts. However, planting those seeds, even in an incomplete state, allows others to see our path and contribute. And with others contributing, we'll iterate faster and we'll accelerate the maturity of our offering faster than GitLab could on its own. We can have a long tail of categories that are at a minimal maturity that don't get investment until they show traction. This approach may sound great in theory, but in practice, it actually puts a lot of pressure on teams to be very intentional about the seeds they plant, and also to have the time and boldness to go back and remove those seeds if needed. Let's take a moment to breathe together. This was a lot in a short time. Breathe in, breathe out. Okay, let's move on to the fix it part, I guess. So how can we address this complexity? Tell me, Pedro, tell me, how can we do this? I can't take it anymore. So finding experience rot is mostly about product judgment and strong leadership. So first of all, you have to study the essential features that users care about and maintain a vision for the experience that only includes those features. And that may involve removing features with every release. And users will thank you, will thank us for that, right? And just because you can add that feature or make that change, it doesn't mean you should. As Steve Jobs once said, you have to pick carefully. I'm actually as proud of the things we haven't done as the things I have done. Innovation is saying no to 1,000 things. And product designers and UX researchers play a key role here. We must help product management make informed decisions and ultimately say no more than yes. This is all beautiful, right? Sounds great. How do we do this? So we can try to use the tools that we already have at our disposal, like jobs to be done, where we understand what users are trying to achieve. We can also use a Kano survey to understand what users value. What are the basic expectations, the performance payoffs, and the excitement generators? And with this information, we can have better product judgment. But how can we make this actionable after we've understood our users? This is the typical roadmap, right? That commits teams to implement specific features. It is oriented around solutions that we don't even know if they are the right ones, and that hinder innovation. Instead, what if we replace this list of features with descriptions of the jobs that people are trying to achieve, the jobs to be done, and the user problems? This is what a UX roadmap looks like, and many of you and many teams have already gone through this process, right? It's centered around the user and their problems and opens up exploration. We're committed to addressing problems, not implementing predetermined solutions. And so with the UX roadmaps and the themes, we can turn the information we have from the jobs to be done and the Kano survey into something actionable. And this is the bridge, the link between product judgment and design judgment. And designers fall in love with the problems. They don't fall in love with the solutions. And when you fall in love with the problem, that's when you can aim for sophisticated simplicity, which is something that many of you may have heard, right? In this battle against complexity, we've seen that experience rot is mostly about product judgments, avoiding the wrong things going into the product. And now for design judgment, we look at sophisticated simplicity. And so this term was coined by Marcel Weyer after studying the work of Steve Jobs and Robert Heinlein, an American science fiction author and aeronautical engineer. And there are 3 levels. The first one, naive simplicity. That's your first attempt at solving a problem. It's a simple solution because you don't fully understand the problem, and it meets the minimum expectations. And after that, you start to understand how complicated the problem really is, and you get into sophisticated complexity. The solution becomes much more complex to try to overcome the shortcomings of the first attempt. So now you're compromising the experience in favor of complexity to meet expectations. And it's only when you dedicate yourself to understand the underlying principles of the problem that you're able to reach nirvana, right? Sophisticated simplicity. That's what we're aiming for. And so now you deeply understand how things work and the most important parts. The solution is now sophisticated, but not complex. It is simple, but not basic. And the design at GitLab, we've come a long way, and we've gone through naive simplicity to sophisticated complexity. And every day we're aiming for the nirvana, the sophisticated simplicity. And particularly relevant to the topic of complexity are the tenets of structure and capability. So if we focus too much on structure and capability, we get sophisticated complexity, wherein everything all the time interface provides a lot of functionality, but the discovery cues that lead to learning, association, and understanding cause and effect aren't present. So let me repeat that to you. Discovery cues that lead to learning, association, and understanding cause and effects. And that's a lot of the feedback, the negative feedback that we've been getting from our users, that it's difficult to learn GitLab. It's difficult to understand the cause and effect and to associate the different parts. And so on the other hand, sophisticated simplicity is an interface that reduces friction, that provides quick access to powerful features and helps all users become more proficient at completing tasks. This all sounds wonderful, but how can you get started? And so in our handbook, we have a few questions, and here's just a glimpse of questions you can ask yourself when designing towards sophisticated simplicity. So first of all, does this content or functionality need to be visible all the time and for everyone? Second, is the structure in support of discovery and use of advanced capabilities? And third, is this feature and or capability even needed or used? Or what would happen if it was removed? You might notice that throughout this presentation, I've been hitting on the removal part a lot. And I'll show you more in a little bit. So let's put it all together. First of all, without a clear understanding of your users, you're stuck, right? Jobs to be done tell you what users are trying to achieve, and the Kano survey tells you what they value. Remember, basic expectations, performance payoffs, and excitement generators. And you can actually already start looking at opportunities to prune experience rot by removing unused features. So you can already start doing that even without that clear understanding. Even if you don't have data to back that up, I bet that you and your team have assumptions about the least used features in your area. So gather the team, talk about it, see what you can do. And it's important to remind you that product leadership has asked everyone to look for these opportunities during this year to deprecate and remove unused and unnecessary features. Third, with UX roadmaps and themes, we shift from committing to features to committing to problems, which in turn give you the room you need to understand the underlying principles of the problem so that you're able to reach sophisticated simplicity. And finally, and this is something that I didn't talk much about today because we don't have time for everything, is the excitement generators, the design for delight. That would probably warrant another UX showcase. So for the time being, I just leave you with these two links in case you're interested in learning more. And this is it for me. I think I kind of structured and repeated a lot of the information that we already have in our handbook and maybe give it a bit more of a body. But I'm looking forward to your questions, so add them to the agenda documents. And to get this going, here are some prompts. How are you struggling or dealing with complexity today in something that you're working on? And what other tools and practices can we use to fight experience rot and aim for sophisticated simplicity? Something that I maybe didn't mention today that would be helpful for everyone. And that's it. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Pedro. That was well said. Very interesting. And we don't have a huge group here, but I'm curious to hear what y'all think about those prompts that you posted, because one thing for us to realize it and have this knowledge, the other thing to try and accomplish it with our counterparts. So I'd be curious what y'all think about that, if you're still awake. Not that Pedro was boring. I found it very interesting. That's not what I meant. I just can't see his face, except Erica's and Pedro's. Anyone there?
Yeah, given that that Jeremy is on the call, I'm going to put you on the spot, Jeremy, in case you have anything you want to share about the sophisticated simplicity part, that I think we're the first person at GitLab to talk more about it and explore it more. So yeah, if you have anything else you'd like to share.
Well, I think first I just say thanks for looping it back in again. It's a challenge. I can say that. I know that one thing I think that several designers are feeling is that during like component migrations, for example, I was just discussing this earlier, the concept of sophisticated simplicity is coming up kind of at a back door where you're migrating an existing experience to a new component, and the old experience maybe had like a bunch of extra complexity or content or interactions that the new component might not support. And so it's an opportunity to look at rethinking that experience and actually aiming for something that's maybe more simple or more boring, for lack of a better term. And so I've seen it come up there. That's just top of mind. So since you put me on the spot, I'm not sure anything else, but yeah, anything specific you'd like me to answer, more specific than that, I suppose?
Oh, no. That was a good example, especially related to the work that you're doing in foundations, and an opportunity to aim for sophisticated simplicity. It's almost like an ideal, I guess. You don't ever reach it; you try to reach it. So thanks for sharing that.
Yeah, and I suppose as a follow-up, maybe I can take a prompt to as part of those migrations to as we don't always understand all the use cases and the historical decisions, but in, much in the way we do with the UI kit, when we update a component, Dan's really good about saying, okay, here's how you use the new one, and here's why, and here's the things that have changed. Perhaps we could start to do some of that more rigorously with component migrations to say, hey, we've removed this complexity in this component. Here's why. Here's how you can migrate to it or rethink your experience to adapt, rather than just a one-to-one, flip the switch. So there might be some things that we can think through in the future. So I think that that's kind of a helpful prompt for foundations. So thank you.
Cool. Austin?
Yeah. Pedro, I was curious to get your thoughts around, do you have tips on how we might be able to accommodate like a vocal minority? This could come through of like, hey, I've submitted a merge request for something that I find is like a preference. I would like to have a shortcut option here. And on the surface, it might seem like this is an innocent change. But I think what you were getting at earlier was every change leads to additional level of support. And do we want to or need to support that long term? That's usually where I run into like, oh yeah, I mean, this seems fine, but then like, does this help everybody? Is this helping just one person? I don't really know. I don't know this area super well. What are your thoughts around that when we see those kind of ideas come through either in our issue backlog or a merge request or whatever it might be?
Yeah. I think so. Either it's something that we've entertained in the past as part of our product discovery work. I'm thinking, for example, it's not something small, it's actually something big, but it's a feature request we have for blocking approval. So it's like a negative approval signal, the opposite of our approve button in MRs. And that has been revisited, and we've touched on that for for some time, and we have kept saying no to that, and we're able to build a specific rationale for why we're not doing it. We were able to distill the problem and understand the basic parts of it. So I think a part of that is just finding time to do that problem validation. And if it is really something important, or if it is like a small user preference, but maybe you see that we're probably going to open a Pandora's box. Like it's a minimal thing, but other people will try to do something similar somewhere else. I think it's worth to pause, and maybe it's more worthwhile to say no than to say yes. And the other thing is maybe we can't afford the time to do it. Maybe we have other pressures, or maybe we just want to find out maybe the effort there to implement it and see if its use is not a lot. Like that, what I was saying with the seed, then nurture strategy principle. I think the problem there is that we have to follow through. We're doing this, but we're going to follow through, and we're going to be like the police of new features, new options, new settings, new preferences. And if it's not being used, or if we do research on it and we realize that it's not helpful, that it's actually deterring us from doing other things, we will be bold enough to remove it. And I'd like to see that more at GitLab. And again, that goes back more to, we can influence it as designers and UX researchers, but ultimately that is more about product judgment, I guess.
Yeah, those are all fair points. I think a personal reflection of mine is it almost feels like our issues backlog is a representation of this creep that we've had. Like I think when I started in 2020, our issues list had like 30,000 open issues. Now we got 60,000 open issues. We don't really take a strong stance on won't do. We just let things sit there. And I think that can sometimes lead to conflicting issues, like different preferences, like, oh, I want option A versus option B. So maybe that's where a place we could start is even when those, it's easier to say when it's a merge request because we make this is merging in or it's not, and then it's closed. But issues is usually where it's harder, where it's like, oh, well, we're just not going to kill the idea. We'll just let it sit there and maybe one day. But okay, yeah, I think it comes down to having those harder conversations with product, and then maybe it's throwing the won't do label on it and closing the issue and just saying why.
Yeah, it's a challenge for sure. You know, it may seem like, you know, with this presentation that I have everything figured out, but I don't. I don't think anyone has, and everyone struggles with this. But it's part of the work, right? This tension is maybe it's the part of our work that will be the last thing to be replaced by AI. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a joke, right? That like engineers will always be needed because no one knows what they actually want. And then you got to tell it very specifically what the requirements are if you want the thing. And we're bad at defining requirements as people. So
Justin, I can for you.
Cool, thanks. My thinking was a possible answer is to reference the tools that Pedro brought up, the jobs to be done, the Kano. We've recently revamped our processes for doing jobs to be done, and we're incorporating a second step. It's more of a ODI side of the jobs to be done model, where you assess what users actually want, which is sort of the whole Kano part of it, and that will help understand how to use those jobs and assess your requests, your feature requests. You know, so you could probably take that information and then go back to your backlog and start to prune by saying, well, yeah, no one actually wants this. We can probably close this, and maybe even reference the data. So it might be a question of going back and looking at your jobs and, you know, do I have high confidence in these? Do I know that these are for real? And if that's the case, then start to measure them against the backlog. And that is also another reference to what Pedro brought up, where he mentioned UX themes and UX roadmaps. That's kind of the step that would happen there. So you take your jobs and you measure it against that when you're building your themes and defining your roadmap. So when he mentioned problem validation, to me, that's what stuck out in my head. That's the type of research in the data that we can use to determine where we go with that. And even clean up those 60,000, that's a lot. But that might be a chore that you have to do, spend a couple days every milestone and just start chipping away at it.
Yeah, just to add to what you were just mentioning, Justin, which I agree. I think, the things that come from the side and issues that are created and ideas of adding this preference or this option, I think if we're able to map out the main job, the small jobs and micro jobs, have this job map, and maybe we can say, oh, we're actually prioritizing this theme here, and this theme, we're not looking a lot here or here, but we've mapped this out in a way that if someone has an idea for this step or this specific micro job, we can immediately say if it aligns with our understanding and what we want, what users want to achieve as part of this job or not. And if it does not fall into that, maybe it's not something we should do, right? Yeah, and I think, we've come a long way in maturing all of this. So we're much better than what we were when I joined 7 years ago. But the issue now is dealing with a lot of legacy, right?
Yeah, and the other side of that coin that's been challenging at times is I'll sometimes hear we have customer XYZ with thousands of seats. They need this. And I actually thought our fireside chat with one of our customers a few weeks ago, they had an insightful thought where they're like, we're a really large organization and we are going to probably request things that maybe don't make sense for smaller teams or other. And the complexity of GitLab is we try and serve both. We try to serve very small teams and ones that are very large. And then who do you give the ultimate preference towards? That's usually where I end up feeling the tension. It's like, yeah, this would be great for the team with 5,000 engineers, but it's completely overkill for the team of 5.
Yeah. I think that was kind of clarified in that MR a couple of weeks ago about design judgment, where it is really important to care and kind of worry about that tension. But at the end of the day, as designers and researchers, where we should focus our efforts and energy is on showing the pros and cons and the trade-offs and helping the product make that informed decision. So at the end of the day, like we're going to have this, which is great, but we're going to lose this, it's product's decision to make, knowing the effects that could have in the overall experience. Camelia, I think you're next.
Yeah, so I just found this really interesting when you talk about the question we ask ourselves, like, is this visible for everyone? And I think we can maybe just add a little bit more question, and we can maybe create a checklist to help us to detail, is this for everyone? It's just for persona. And a very simple example is is this really for people new to GitLab, or is it people already use GitLab for a long time? So the dimension of user is not only persona and the role. So sometimes I feel if we use persona, we're really focused on just he need this job to be done, but we a little bit look over of the experience of this user in this job. And we can just add some additional question to help us to say that can this be done by a new user, and if that's simple enough for a new user, or can we determine is for advanced people, can they directly find what they need of the advanced people, they don't need to go over a wizard or something. So all those questions can help us to go to the simplified goal. And I think maybe with the collective effort, we can make a question list like just generally as a checklist we ask for ourselves could be a good idea for this like a methodology that lead us to simplicity.
Yeah, I agree. I think we try, generally speaking, to when we're doing solution validation, to try to include novice and more experienced users. The thing I like about sophisticated simplicity and the way we describe it is the more you understand the problem and the fundamental parts of the problem, it allows you, in theory, to design an experience that is understandable by all. Of course, in our case, we have a lot of other constraints, and maybe we have to deal with technical knowledge and domain knowledge that is difficult to just quickly, replace. There's also, in that workshop that I had with Dana Chitsnell and Jared Spool, they talked about that. They talked about the difference between these kinds of users and how can we bridge that gap. And there are basically two things you can do. One is you invest in training, and you basically have to teach users to use the thing. And there are many ways to do it, but that's the most effortful thing. Like you're asking a lot of effort from users to learn. And then the other thing is trying to bring down the required knowledge to use something. And usually you can do that without hurting the more experienced users a lot. And we usually tend to, at GitLab, look more at the experienced users because we are so much into the technology and how the APIs work and what is needed in this case, and designing the most complex cases, that I think sometimes we forget about, hey, maybe if we simplified all of this, we can actually solve the same thing simply for 80% of the use cases, and even for experienced users, and novice users would be, good with it as well. So I think sometimes we get trapped in our own design process because we're power users of GitLab. We tend to design for the worst case scenarios, and we tend to design for complexity in a way, right? We tend to, which is the sophisticated complexity piece, but we fail to reach the sophisticated simplicity, sometimes because we don't have enough time to think about the problems deeply.
Yeah, I agree. We can bring it down. I'm also curious, like from the research, do we know that like when user actually really gets the learning curve, and do they find it easy or not? So that's also like can balance as our effort to bring the feature down to easier for everyone, and also like to balance the power users. Like I think from the research, like I barely hear about like how power user thinks, or how do we define power users. Like maybe that's also a proof evidence when we convince like the product managers or give them more informations that we should think about the users who has less background knowledge about technology or something. So that could be something we serve, I don't know, like in a general research in the future. Yeah, I have a second point is related. So it's like just related with the topic. Like we use a lot of like technology, like in GitLab. So we recently in the government, in the policy settings, we face the thing that like each time you create a setting, create something, you need to go through MR review. So you change something, basically you are changing the YAML code because you're changing the YAML file, and it goes through the MR review. But then like the MR review is designed for code review. It's not designed for settings. So those people who change the settings, they might not know all the code conflicts and all the aspect, all the feature we bring on the MR page. But we are bringing them there because like there is a potential need. They want to review the change, or like there is just easiness for us to push MVC. but then like we increase the complexity in this way. And we have this like subconscious thing because we have the Git like technology there for us, easy to use. It's easy for us then, but it's more complex become for certain users. So I think like that's also something we can add to the question list, like each time.
That's a great example. I love that. Yeah, and that goes back to if we really understand the essential parts of the problem, what users are trying to achieve and what is essential to them, we can better show the different options, right? In this case, hey, this is the MR route and it has these benefits, but it also adds these cons. You have this impact on complexity because you're shifting to somewhere else and you lose context. And then there's this other option that maybe is not the most powerful, but it actually gets things done in a simple way. Yeah, I think your thought process is on point. Is now just trying to see how you can visualize that and help product management make the best decision, because as you said, it's not just about the final outcome of the user. It's also how quickly we can get something out and using a boring solution. But sometimes the boring solution ends up being more complex. So it's that trade-off.
Yeah, I think we can definitely work together and to make it simpler. Probably like other stage facing similar problems. I think Becca has something there.
Yeah, I was just going to mention that just to piggyback off what you were saying, Camelia, like we come across this problem in Secure and Govern about people just want to see if a scanner is turned on for a certain project or for a group, but it's just not that easy because of how it works with Git and YAML files. It's just too complex. So we want to deliver something really simple and straightforward, but it's just not how it works. So what seems like a really straightforward request and straightforward UI actually can't be done. And if anybody's curious about what I'm talking about here, there's two issues that are 3+ years old. So yeah, sometimes the way that technology works on the back end can prevent us from doing more simple things on the front end too.
Thanks for sharing.
There's a truth that I've come to realize through my years of working in this industry, and that's it's a tough one, but I think it's similar to what everyone's talking about. Is if you want to make a UI that is super usable, super simple, really solves the problems, generally that means it's going to be really hard to build. And that's hard to explain and to communicate and get your counterparts to accept, especially when we're talking about our speed and the number of users we have and the complexity of the product. So everything I think that we're talking about is a little bit of that, but it's also a little bit of balance. And how do we collaborate with our counterparts to explain these things, to provide the data that we're using, the thought processes that we're using, and help them come along and understand those things. There can be a adversarial feeling sometimes, right? Because we all have these different perspectives. So we as the UX people have to figure out how to best communicate these things, so we can get everyone to understand our point of view while also trying to understand theirs. We have to put on our UX hats even when we're talking with our counterparts. That part never changes. We have to use empathy. But I think that that's the hard part. And I think what Camelia may have been getting at is what can we get some more tools that we can use to help those conversations and have those conversations. And some of those tools is research and data, but also reminders to us while we're going through it. What questions should we be asking ourselves that we can also then pose to our counterparts? So it's an age-old problem since UX has been started. We have a higher maturity than most companies, but it doesn't mean that we can rest on our laurels and not expect to have to continuously push that perspective and educate everyone with the knowledge that we have, while also accepting the knowledge they have. So it's a tough one. That was my soapbox.
I mean, I feel like what also can add to this is, I mean, we want to consider all of our users, you know, people on the free plan, people on Ultimate, but there's also that, like, from a business perspective, it makes sense to prioritize the features and requests from the higher paying customers. So I don't know, this a lot of interesting thoughts going through my head, and I'm curious what my PM has to say about some of them. But I think that's, from my perspective, that's largely where our PMs create a roadmap, is they're on customer calls and you know, not just that, I mean, they're aware of like what competitors are doing and where strategically we should move in the space in general compared to other tools out there. But there can be maybe a difference when it comes to prioritizing, like, which features do we ship, or do we ship them at all? If I do solution validation on something and I'm just recruiting any security engineer or developer who uses security tools, I mean, it opens up the door to maybe a lot more use cases than just the customers who are paying for Ultimate or are open to paying for Ultimate and giving them what they want, right?
Yeah, and that goes back to the balance thing. You know, ultimately we're a business, right? But we have to. There's a lot of things in there. We have to balance business needs with user needs, but then there's also a side that says, if you can truly make a product that is built for what our users really need and want, and it solves the goals, the problems that they're trying to solve, you'll kind of get that purchasing customer, you know, paying benefit sort of inherently, you know, if we're doing it correctly. So there's a lot of variables that we have to consider and be able to talk to our counterparts about. You know, we all know these things.
As my manager just, you know, every time I go through solution validation, it's always a question of, and this was mentioned earlier, do I talk to people that don't have GitLab familiarity, people that are brand new to it, or do I just go with the people who are familiar with GitLab and how it works, and maybe understand why we can't show that SaaS is enabled or not enabled reliably?
It depends what question you're trying to answer, and what data you're trying to get to prove your point.
Yeah, I mean, of course, I want it to be easy for a first-time user, and I want it to be easy for somebody who's been doing it for 10 years. But I think it's easier to design a product for the expert, because otherwise we end up in this just minefield of info icons. What's this? What's this? What's this? Having to like explain every little thing. I know we've struggled with that a little bit in Secure and Govern. And then just having like the page description linked to the docs, maybe just the docs can explain it. So we have to try to describe everything on the page, but yeah, I think when, you know, my I think when product management is on a lot of those customer calls, they may also not be prioritizing the first time user. They may be hearing feedback from people who are using it on a daily or weekly basis. And so I don't know, this is a theory, but maybe those expert users are the ones that, you know, have their voices heard the most, rather than newbies that may come and try it out and then abandon. So I'm just thinking out loud.
But I still think that it comes down to collaboration and discussion. You know, we all have different points of view and different types of knowledge and goals for our own roles. You know, from the UX leadership side, we're saying as UXers, we need to help explain the user side of things, whereas PM's, you know, goal might be, well, we have to make money. We have to build users. We have to build MAU, you know, and to prove that this particular feature is worthwhile. So someone from UX doesn't come in and say, no one's using this feature, let's remove it. You know, there are different goals that everyone has. And I think that's why it's important that we all have that conversation together out in the open and explain these things. But we have to have the data, the jobs to be done, the research, in order to show and prove that what we're saying is valid. You know, and then you have to come to the right conclusion together. Balance. What is the effort impact? You know, all of these various tools. Camelia, you have a comment?
Yeah, just a quick thing. Maybe just sometimes if we are meeting like customer for a long time, they're expert. It's always helpful to shift the mind to say that can we get new customer with the feature? Like what if we want to get more new customers? That's also like kind of a business need. We just maybe don't think about it very often. And maybe that's the task of the salespeople, not us. Like maybe they can like provide some data. That's also some data point we can use.
Yeah, I think that's a good point.
Yeah, I was just going to add back. I think the novice versus expert users, we just have to figure out what is the typical knowledge level of that persona and design for that, because it is very easy for us to fall into designing for the power user, as like the example that Camelia was giving before of, hey, do we go the MR route or just like a very simple diff thing that you know, just for the settings? And maybe the power users would love the MR route because they're already using MRs. They can make the best advantage of that. And so we have to understand for this persona, what is the knowledge threshold? What are the minimum things they need to know to get this going? And that knowledge will probably change over time. I'm thinking about AI, where we need to have disclaimers everywhere because it's a fairly new thing for most people, and especially applied in the DevOps space. So we need to have disclaimers everywhere. Like, you know, you're designing that thing for the security, you know, oh, don't use this code with caution or blah, blah, blah. And over time, that knowledge will kind of fade away, and you will need less knowledge to understand that. And we will need less info or help icons or popovers because people will already be familiar with that. In the same way that we're familiar with the patterns and metaphors in you know, across common UI patterns. So I think it's figuring that out. And so that's why I think it is always helpful to have a mix of participants in our studies, and don't just discard the new users as, oh, you know, but those are new users. Like it's normal that they don't get it. Like, is it really that normal? Like, what is I mean, we have to pick something to prioritize. We have to pick a kind of user to prioritize the experience for. I don't think we can just be designing modes for all different permutations of kinds of users. So it's just figuring out what does the typical security engineer knows, what's the knowledge that they have about this topic, and design for that, while trying to make the experience as simple as possible, so that even the power users will thank you for being able to do the same things or the most common tasks in a much simpler way. Because that's what we see over and over with many tools, is that they begin catering to more and more and more and more power users. Take like Photoshop versus Figma, right? You could do UI design with Photoshop for years, right? But you couldn't do it as well as Figma, because Figma really focused on a specific set of visual design capabilities that Photoshop already had, and even explored others. And power users thanked for that, because it's much simpler to design UIs in Figma than it was in Photoshop. So yeah, it's those two things: knowing what is the typical knowledge and trying to design the simplest experience. But for that, you really need to understand the problem.
And on that awesome note, thank you all for a great conversation. Look forward to the other recordings once they're posted, and I will also post them in our Slack channels. And with that, have a good rest of your day, y'all. Thank you.
Bye-bye. Thank